Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by with the major season 3 update here in Warzone. We obviously saw a bunch of weapon updates and meta updates with various different buffs and nerfs, primarily to Black Ops 6 weapons. We also got the introduction of our new season 3 weapons as well. And so that said, today I wanted to go through and break down the entirety of the new season 3 meta, go through all the changes and adjust our overall tier list here, breaking down the absolute meta options, the true meta contenders, what's generally competitive here, and then also what's more mediocre, which you probably don't want to use. If you've noticed a trend here, most of what's more mediocre is not Black Ops 6 guns, and I think that trend is going to be even more highlighted, so to speak, with season 3, because they ended up buffing a lot of Black Ops 6 weapons in ways that do create a separation between them and the older game weapons. Now, they did mention in the future they're going to buff MW2 and MW3 weapons in a similar way. I'm very much so looking forward to that day, but for now, we got quite a meta shakeup here in terms of TTK and gameplay feel. While maybe not necessarily we're going to see huge shakeups from absolute meta down into like the competitive category, what we're going to see is just how good these absolute meta and generally meta contender weapons are standing out now versus before in terms of how good they feel because of some of the damage changes. But first up here, we got to start off with our new weapons. And of course, huge shout out to Community, the site that I'm using for this, for having this whole meta tier list. I'll leave a link to mine down in the description below if you ever want to check it out for yourself, see what weapons you might want to work on leveling up or check out yourself. But here, first up, it's pretty funny because our new season 3 weapons are kind of insane, honestly. The CR56 AMAX dropping right into the absolute meta tier. This thing's TTK is insane. It's pretty easy to use after you get used to the recoil pattern. It's pretty versatile and aggressive as well. Thing is a beast. Kilo is right there with it as well. The TTK is not as crazy on the Kilo, but this is a laser beam, so good with velocity. It's going to feel very, very consistent and reliable over long range. Thing is fantastic. And then our new sniper, the HDR, also an absolute meta option here. One shot range for the headshot is insane. Crazy good velocity as well. Decently fast too. It's checking all the right boxes. Literally all of our brand new weapons are phenomenal. Not a huge surprise because obviously they're trying to bring the hype with this season. The focus and the emphasis on the throwback weapons here is strong, so they're going to be very competitive, and they are all great choices now. But that said, we also saw a bunch of different weapon buffs and nerfs. So I've got my handy dandy list of notes summarizing all the changes for each of these weapons. So if you see me looking over here, that's what I'm reading off, so we can quickly go through our list here and break down what's changed. So initially, AK-74 got a damage buff but a range nerf. So this means that the TTK, particularly when you're like in the mid-range area specifically, is going to feel crazy. Over range, it's going to be more dependent on your accuracy over anything, but the damage is better on the AK-74. It's one of the best TTK options in the game. Takes a bit more getting used to because it has a bit more recoil, but this thing will melt if you know what you're doing with it. Thing is pretty wild, if I do say so myself. The aims also saw a damage buff, but it actually got a long range damage nerf ever so slightly and a bit of a range nerf. So this thing is still very good. It's not going to be as solid as it was before, but if you're looking again for a low recoil, easy to use rifle, the aims is going to be a choice there that fits that criteria really well. So I'd say it still sits in absolute meta, but over longer ranges, you might notice it's not going to be as effective as it was before. That's one that's more so bordering absolute meta and general meta contender, I would say. Now the AS Val ended up getting a damage buff and a range nerf as well. Really isn't gonna again shake it up all that much, but it is gonna feel more reliable. Specifically in the mid-range, I think is where this thing thrives the most. Over long range, its damage per mag is just a lot more noticeable when there is a bit more accuracy factored into the fight, but the AS Val still a solid choice here, just not as good as maybe some of these other rifles on the list. This is maybe the wildest one that we have, the Cypher, which was already maybe the #1 gun in the game. I think in a lot of people's eyes, it was the go-to gun. It got a damage buff and a range nerf as well. But with the range nerf, this thing is so easy to use that it's going to be accurate across the board, and the damage buff to it means that it's going to fry even more. I mean, this has been a go-to mainstay in my loadout so far. Specifically for Verdansk, it's going to be great on Rebirth as well. Thing is crazy. Now, the GPR honestly probably could have been more like down in the contenders category before this. I think really is a more accurate placing in the general meta contender category now. Maybe even borderline on absolute meta because of its buffs. It got a damage buff, a range nerf again, but then also a recoil buff. So it's even easier, and it was already a very straightforward weapon to use. So this is one that's trending upwards. I don't know if this buff in and of itself is something that absolutely makes it have the jump to absolute meta. I think I'm going to leave it in just general meta for now, but definitely one I've got my eye on as sort of a sleeper option here that is getting better and better, and hopefully continues to trend in that direction because it's a very fun weapon to use. Now, the Krig is an interesting one because statistically its TTK is crazy, and it got a close damage buff, although not a damage buff to its mid and the long range like some of these other weapons have got. It also got a range nerf, and the Krig's recoil is awkward. I don't think it's too terribly difficult, but it is a little bit random and a little bit clunky compared to other weapons. And so with a range nerf and then only a close damage buff, I think there is some separation with the Krig and some of these other rifles. This is one that ultimately I do feel is more so better fit to be a meta contender just because of its behavior, its feel. These other weapons don't necessarily have that same concern, maybe outside of the AK, which has that more rough recoil, but also it's got the insane damage on the flip side, right? So it sort of balances itself out. The Krig though is a little bit more strange in that regard, so I think that one does get knocked down a tad bit. Still very good obviously, but not necessarily as reliable as it was before this update. Now the Model L, already a meta contender, got another strange update too. It got a close damage buff, but the Model L is not really used for close range. It also got a range nerf. This thing's relatively easy to use, so I think this one's just going to stay as a meta contender. That's an update really that is more impactful on the range than anything else. That close damage buff is not going to be felt all that much, where you're likely using this thing the vast majority of the time, right? Then our XM4, just sitting here in the contender category, ended up getting a damage buff, but then a range nerf. The damage on the XM4 though is still not that great. Its TTK is noticeably slower after being so good for so long compared to a lot of other rifles, so that one's just going to stay in the contender category for now. Easy to use, but not that rewarding in the grand scheme of things. Then lastly, for the rifles, the Goblin MK2, completely different update than everything else. It just got an ADS speed buff. Its TTK is totally dependent on how fast you can spam it and stay accurate, and if you can do that fast and hit shots, its TTK is unmatched. Basically, it's just the highest skill gap weapon probably in the absolute meta category, but so rewarding if you know what you're doing with it. And by the way, as we are going through all the weapon updates and changes here today, if you enjoy the video, you find the info helpful, a like rating is always seriously appreciated. And if you're new to the channel, you want to guarantee that every single day you are in the know for everything going on in COD, this is the place to be, so feel free to hit that subscribe button and turn on those post notifications. Next up, several SMG updates happened with Season 3. The Tanto currently sitting in the contender category just because its TTK is not that crazy and the fire rate's kind of awkward. Ended up getting a damage buff and a range nerf, so solid for the damage buff, but its range drops off really hard, and so that's something that's going to continue to limit it unless it gets a significant buff. So unfortunately, the Tanto is not really going to see any movement here. It's going to kill a little bit quicker if you're super up close, but if you're not super up close, yeah, good luck. And for what it's worth, if you're super up close, there's several other choices here for close range options that are going to be a lot more reliable. Now the SOG actually got some pretty cool updates, a damage buff, range nerf as well. You can somewhat counter that by using certain attachments, extending out that damage range if you want. This is one though that I think does end up making the jump up into the absolute meta category. Its mobility is insane. Recoil is a little bit strange. It's something you have to get used to, but now it's got a super competitive TTK with that damage buff, and you factor in the mobility and everything. It really feels like the Jackal did towards the start of the year, where it's just really fast, really agile, but also can kill really quick as well. It's sort of the best of both worlds there with TTK and movement. So this is one that I've been using a lot the past few days. Big fan of the changes to this one. The PPSH, already an absolute meta option, also got a damage buff and a range nerf, so not going to change it too much here. The range is still fantastic on the PPSH. Its control with the iron sights is a little bit odd at times, but it's again a weapon that you can learn and do really well with if you care about putting in that extra time and effort. Thing can be a beast. The PP919, the Bison, also saw a damage buff and a range nerf, like so many weapons in this update did. Another change, it's going to be sort of a lateral in terms of where it's moving on the meta tier list. Its TTK is still just a little bit behind some of those other choices. Its damage range is also a little bit lackluster compared to what I think it probably should be for a weapon of this behavior. Still a good choice here, but definitely not an absolute meta SMG choice as it stands. Another change I'm a big fan of, the KSV, damage buff, range nerf. The KSV's range is still fantastic, and it being even stronger is awesome because the KSV was already one of the best SMGs in the game. I personally love the feel of this thing if you're using it for sniper support or just close range dominance. It can kind of do it all. It's one of my favorite choices for all weapons in the game currently. The Compact also saw several updates, a little bit different here because they buffed its overall damage, which is solid. The close range got a buff, and its long range got a nerf there. So this thing is going to be one of the best options in the game for close range. It's going to spray and pray because its fire rate is so fast, but it's going to melt at the same time. thing is a beast, and for the close range, it just got even more lethal, which is kind of crazy. The Jackal also ended up seeing a damage buff, a range nerf, but then they also nerfed its long range in specific there as well, a little bit more. With the Jackal though, it's still going to be very competitive. It's still got great movement mechanics and great movement stats there, similar to like the Sog and whatnot, so you can really be versatile with how you're navigating the map with this thing, and it's going to be a bit more straightforward as an SMG in general. Competitive TTK, not the best in game, but still very well rounded. I think it's going to sit in the more so meta contender category, because I would still be opting for, you know, a compact or a Sog over it right now, but it's still definitely one of the better close range options as it stands. Then the C9, maybe the best overall SMG in the game. Damage buff, range nerf. Its range is still pretty forgiving, all things considered, and its damage being even better is awesome. It's going to melt up close, still staying in that absolute meta category. Now, we did end up seeing a couple of shotgun updates here. So the ASG saw a slight range buff. It's not a super substantial range buff though, and quite frankly, shotguns as it stands are not really fantastic close range options. They probably need to be buffed to be more competitive with a lot of the SMGs, but currently they're mostly just mediocre options. There are ones that can excel if you know exactly what you're doing, but they're not that versatile. They're stuck to being just super up close, and even then they have the potential to be outgunned. So not going to really change the ASG all that much just with that update by itself. The Maelstrom also saw a range buff, but once more, not super significant. The Marine SP is a little bit more competitive than those two aforementioned shotties. It also got a range buff and then also a medium damage buff, which is solid, so it's trending in the right direction. It's still not going to be a fantastic, like absolute broken shotgun meta by any means, but it's at least a little bit better. Certainly a competitive option, but nothing that crazy. Now, the Fang currently sits in the meta contender category, and I think this is a really good place for it, especially after this update where it got a damage buff and a range buff. This thing's going to have a fantastic mid to long range TTK. Its use and its behavior is a little bit awkward because it does have like a slower fire rate, so if you miss shots, the TTK drop off is going to be a bit more noticeable. It's got a little bit of a delay there, just kind of feels a bit clunky. However, if you're landing shots with it, it can melt, and it's a pretty easy weapon to use in terms of recoil and whatnot. So it's got its drawbacks, but it also has its definitely standout pros, I would say. Big fan of the Fang. I think this is another slept on gun, certainly a meta contender as it stands. Now, the GPMG ended up getting a damage buff, but it got a close range nerf and a long range buff in terms of range values. Interesting changes there. Not sure why the close range needed to be nerfed. Nonetheless, it's still going to be an LMG, so it's a little bit slower, a little bit heavier, and in the current meta, while its damage is all right, it's nothing crazy, but it's not terrible, it is going to be noticeably less versatile than other LMGs or other rifles that we have in the meta as it stands. So sort of a lateral move there as well. And same deal with the PU-21, damage buff, but then a close range nerf there. So kind of just an awkward update. The close range is not going to be super important on LMGs because you're using them at 50, 60, 70, 80 meters and not 20, 30, 40 meters, right? Now, the XMG, another meta contender, gets shaken up a little bit. It got a close damage buff. It got a long damage nerf, so its longer damage range is going to be a little bit worse now in terms of with the TTK there, but it got a long range buff, so that range is going to be better, and then a close range nerf, so it like inversed itself. It got better and worse both up close and at a range. Now, luckily, the XMG is still a really reliable and consistent TTK. It's also incredibly easy to use with the recoil here, but it's still going to be an LMG. So while its damage is competitive with maybe some other rifles on the list, its movement, its mobility, its versatility, still a tad bit limited there. So if you're a slower paced player, you like to sit back and spray and pray, you don't have to work too much to stay on target, the XMG is going to be a good choice there laterally in terms of where it's moving with this update though. Now, the AEK also got a damage buff. It's particularly in the meta contender category because of the full auto mod. It also was buffed there and adjusted in a handful of ways. Big fan of the full auto feel for this thing. Very fun to use. It is limited by its DPM a lot, which is why it can't really be in the absolute meta category as of right now unless you're like exclusively playing solos, but this is one I've definitely got my eye on as a slept on build that can be very good in the right hands. The DM10 is one that honestly I'm a little bit torn on because this got a damage buff, a long range damage nerf though ever so slightly, but then also a range buff. It has so much potential to be very good. It's just when you compare it to the Goblin wins. That's going to be the more relied upon option, I think, for a lot of players. So having them in the same category just doesn't necessarily feel right, but I think the DM10 is on the up and up for sure. Definitely a weapon that if you're good with semi-auto guns, you can excel with quite a bit. And we've got quite the come up here because the SWAT 556, one of the lower rated weapons in the game here, down in the more viable but probably should have been trash tier category in the burst mode, ended up getting its own damage buff and range buff, but now it also has the Grau 556 conversion kit, which is awesome. So with this, the Grau 556 conversion, I think truly lands right between absolute meta and meta. It is borderline right there in the middle. It is limited by its attachments some, because it being a conversion kit that's obviously going to use one attachment outright, and then it does block off like using a barrel and whatnot. So I think the more so meta contender category is where it's going to sit currently. It's got a competitive TTK though, really good range. I love the irons. They're not as good as the original, but they're still solid. But that does make the SWAT 5.56, even though you're technically using it for a different weapons reason, a pretty good option now for sure. So very excited the Grau is back. I hope they do it a little bit more justice and make it a tad bit more competitive though, so it can be in this absolute meta category. Now the TR2 or FAL, it got a damage buff, it got a range nerf, but also the flinch is not as bad. Now it's still again not a semi-auto gun that's going to necessarily stand up to the Goblin in a lot of cases, so obviously going to be limited in that regard. I still think I'd lean more towards like a DM10 in this case for something in that area for semi-auto guns, but it's getting better, which is nice. I would love to see the FAL meta return so you can have that as like a versatile option, but trending upwards for sure. Then our Sarkov down here in the more viable category ended up getting a damage buff, but then a long damage nerf, so its long range damage is not going to be as good, but then it got a range buff as well. Really, this thing's down here because its behavior is just not good, and it's got a mediocre TTK even after some of these updates, so just too awkward of a weapon to really be all that practical. You could use it if you want, like if you're going for camos and plunder, you're going to be able to take out players with it, but it's not going to be ideal. This is another cool one here. The Kar 98K, already an absolute meta sniper because of its quick ADS, super aggressive, and then decent one-shot range, about 67 meters or so. Ended up getting a torso, arm, and leg multiplier buff. So its two-shot potential is going to be more reliable and more consistent now if you don't get that one-shot headshot knock. So the Kar just becomes more reliable in general. I love that. So if you don't want like a heavier sniper option like the HDR or the Frostline or the LR762, you have the much more aggressive and versatile Kar 98K choice. We did see a couple of pistol updates, which are honestly kind of laughable because the 9mm PM is already in the trash tier category because it's just weak and it's a pistol. It's never going to actually stack up in the close range. It got a damage nerf. Now its range is better, but the damage is not good in those ranges. So this thing's staying in the trash tier. Honestly, if it could get worse, I might be dropping it down even more. The Grakova, at least, is one that got slightly better here. It's a nice little pocket SMG, but the Seer 9mm is just a better choice in general. But with the Grakova, ended up getting a damage buff, but then a range nerf. So at least it's a little bit better up close, but still not my first choice by any means. The GS45, maybe the worst pistol in the game, got a damage nerf, so it's going to do less damage now. It's going to be even weaker, but its range is better. Whoop-de-doo. Again, if I could drop this lower, I would. And then also, the Strider ended up getting a damage nerf, but then a range buff here. That honestly is close to dropping it down into the trash tier, but at least with a Strider, you can spam it some. But really, pistols are not ideal for any meta loadouts to begin with, unless you're straight up going for camos. I mean, good luck with these two down here, because they are not good. While we're down here in the trash tier category, the launchers are all kind of doing the same thing here. Several launchers got updates. They have slightly better damage and slightly better range, but they're not realistic meta options, right? Like the trash tier category here is more so trash plus the niche category, like you're using them for very specific situations and not in a competitive sense. So those updates to the ranges and the damage for the launchers, not really super relevant. And then because the Siren classifies as a special weapon, it's actually not available in the categories here, but it'd be more so a contender option, a viable option as like a secondary if you're using gunfighter, not anything seriously competitive versus an SMG. So that said, those are all the weapon updates, and you'll notice now that, yeah, ultimately we didn't see that many shakeups in terms of weapons jumping from category to category. What stands out now more though is that particularly the absolute meta weapons here are going to have much more of a gap on the meta contenders, and especially the more competitive options, because of the buffs to the Black Ops 6 weapons in particular with their TTK stats. Even some of these meta contender options, well, yes, there are some really good MW3 ones, like the MCW conversion kit's awesome, the Shroud is awesome, the Striker's pretty solid there. You're gonna have the gap in the SMGs here, where the SOG, the Compact, the KSV, the C9, they just feel noticeably better because they're BO6 guns, and the damage buffs up close are gonna be noticeable as well. So they've created a layer of separation here with particularly Black Ops 6 meta weapons, and then the other games meta weapons, but then also what the absolute meta is right now is really going to feel like it fries. So I'm hoping that they do go through and they do these MW2 and these MW3 buffs in the near future, so we can have a more competitive meta, especially with the meta contenders and the absolute meta weapons and what's beneath them. Because truthfully right now, if you're not using something in the meta category or the absolute meta category, you're probably going to be spending a lot of time spectating or in the gulag. That's just sort of the nature of the beast right now. These weapons, while they're okay, are not going to thrive in a competitive standpoint because of the damage updates with how they're pushing this faster TTK right now. But that said, these weapons do feel very good, which is at least solid there, and you've got quite a few choices if you're looking for sniper gameplay, mid-range, long-range, something more versatile for the close range. You've got some good choices. That's going to wrap things up for this video, though. If you're looking for full meta loadouts and breakdowns for weapons like this, we've already posted a top 10 for this season here. We'll be updating that as the season goes on and we see various other buffs and nerfs. So as anything gets changed or updated, I'll be keeping you guys in the know alongside everything else going on in COD. All that info is here on a daily basis, so feel free to hit that subscribe button. And if you enjoyed the video, a like rating on your way out would be seriously appreciated. But once again, thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, take it easy, have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll catch you later. Peace out.